Sharon, thank you. A Green Lake County man says he took early retirement from the Department of Corrections because of death threats placed on him and dangers to inmates and their families over the leaking of confidential information during an investigation at a state prison. It involves an employee at Redgranite Correctional Institute releasing the identities of prison informants in two high-profile cases out of Milwaukee involving a homicide and death threats to a former assistant district attorney.
The former gang investigator who was in charge of the operation came to Target 2 Investigates, telling us he's waited months for state officials to investigate and to take action. Sarah Thomsen has been trying to sort this all out over the last several weeks, and after starting to ask questions and push officials on it, changes are happening. She joins us with what she found.
Jason Wilkie retired from the Department of Corrections 3 weeks ago after a 20-year career with DOC, 15 as a gang investigator within the state's prisons. He's a state trainer and travels the country teaching others about gang trends and intervention. But it was a difficult year-long investigation he was conducting at Redgranite Correctional, he says changed his life.
It's utterly disgusting. There are members of the community, to include myself, who now have active threats on their lives due to his intentional misconduct.
The frustration in Jason Wilkie's voice is unmistakable.
In 20 years of corrections, I've seen some bad things, but I've never seen anything like the Emoji incident.
In January of last year, Wilkie was assigned to work a gang investigation inside Redgranite Correctional.
We had some informants come forward that indicated that he wanted to harm or kill the prosecutor that had tried him and convicted him and sentenced him to prison. So that's not something that you take lightly.
Wilkie says recording devices were placed inside cells of inmates working as informants who knew they were being recorded. He says staff assigned to the area knew it too, but a few days before the devices were set to activate, Wilkie says informants' identities were suddenly revealed.
Took a rat emoji and placed it next to each informant's name. He actually put a rat emoji, $, and 5.
Those were your 5 informants?
Correct, for this very high-profile investigation.
Wilkie says inmates saw that piece of paper, known as a range board, containing the names and cell location of each inmate in the housing unit sitting on an officer's desk. We've blurred all names to protect their identities.
At that point in time, every single informant was known to the inmate population, and it doesn't take rocket science to understand what a rat means inside of a correctional facility.
Target 2 obtained DOC records of the investigation that shows inmates made a copy in the library and were attempting to mail it out of the institution. Wilkie's concern turned to the inmates and their families.
If you look at it from a threat group level, informants are killed, and that is extremely upsetting to me because these people worked with us to save the life of a prosecutor.
Wilkie says he went to the warden and security director and tells Target 2 they told him they'd investigate. Less than a week later, DOC records show an employee provided a signed statement admitting to placing the rat emojis next to inmate names. Out of what the DOC calls legitimate safety and security concerns, we are choosing not to name that staff member at this point. In his statement, that corrections employee wrote, "There was no malice and no intent to cause unrest, but to simply make aware and share information for staff's use only," adding he thought that housing area was turning into an unstable environment, and by having these inmates on the same wing would eventually cause chaos. He ended writing, "I am sorry and sincerely apologize for my mistake." 3 months later, Warden Michael Meisner handed down a 1-day suspension to that employee, determining he violated a work rule. In that entire rat emoji investigation, Wilkie says he was never interviewed, and he feels the entire incident wasn't taken seriously.
And they did nothing.
Wilkie thinks this is criminal misconduct, but no criminal charges have been filed. Wilkie says the case was never referred to law enforcement and showed Target 2 this email from the prison's Human Resources Department confirming that. DOC policy says the warden or designee may refer to law enforcement where there are threats to a person within or outside the facility. In October, Wilkie says staff at another prison told him some inmates involved have placed death threats against him and his family. He now has law enforcement protection. Wilkie tells us he's not concerned about identifying himself publicly because he says those threatening him already know who he is.
But to me, that is very concerning that I lose sleep over at nighttime is actually the informant's family members, who are completely innocent members of the Wisconsin community.
Wilkie has contacted officials in Madison and tells us he's concerned all of this was swept under the rug and worries more people are in danger. So he contacted Target 2.
So I believe that there were a lot of people, leadership in Madison, who really did not know that this took place. And by the time they became aware of it, in their opinion, it was just too late.
Wilkie arranged a meeting with 2 state lawmakers last Friday.
Not the following Tuesday after we met, things started happening.
Target 2 filed open records requests Monday. Tuesday, Wilkie says he met with the newly appointed DOC Secretary, Kevin Carr.
I believe it's criminal misconduct, and on Friday I will be meeting with law enforcement investigators to actually pursue that.
When asked why he's coming forward now, Wilkie says he's trying to ensure similar behavior doesn't happen again.
I have actually informed them of every single step that I'm going to take in an effort to make this wrong a right.
Late this afternoon, we received a statement from the DOC saying Secretary Carr has been briefed on the situation and has now directed DOC staff to review all processes related to this complaint. It also says the DOC contacted local law enforcement about the death threats against Wilkie when it learned of them, adding public safety is a priority.
From WBAY TV, coverage you can count on. Action 2 News at 5 starts now.
Good evening. Thanks for joining us. A Wisconsin prison inmate is receiving tens of thousands of dollars from the state of Wisconsin to settle a federal lawsuit.
That payment comes from your taxpayer money. The lawsuit stems from an incident at Redgranite Correctional. Target 2 investigates first uncovered back in January. Sarah Thomsen has been following this case closely now for months. She joins us now with what she's found out. Sarah.
Well, Kami and Bill, this has become known as what prison employees and even state employees now call the rat emoji incident. Last year, a now former corrections sergeant at the Redgranite prison exposed the identity of 5 inmates who were acting as confidential informants in a high-profile undercover gang investigation. One of those inmates filed a federal civil rights lawsuit, and now the man convicted of armed robbery is getting a big payday.
You get up every day with a drive to have justice, and you have this roller coaster where you have highs and lows.
Jason Wilkie, known around the country for his work infiltrating gangs and prisons, spends nearly every waking minute thinking about that day last January when the identities of 5 inmates who he had turned into confidential informants were outed. DOC records obtained by Target 2 show then Redgranite Correctional Sergeant Robert Wilcox placed rat emojis next to all 5 inmates' names on a piece of paper left on a prison desk in view of other inmates. Almost immediately, inmates not only saw it, but made a copy and tried to mail it out of the prison. The informant's covers blown.
His life is clearly in danger, along with 4 other individuals. These criminal organizations, they don't forgive and they don't forget.
One of those informant inmates, Joseph T. Benson, filed a federal lawsuit in April of 2018, claiming his constitutional rights were violated, seeking more than $600,000. He obtained a lawyer in February of this year. 3 months later, the case settled out of court. Target 2 obtained the settlement agreement from the Wisconsin Department of Justice, showing the state agreed to pay $110,000 to a trust account held by Benson's lawyer. The DOJ tells us that check was sent May 21st.
Were you surprised that they settled?
I wasn't surprised that they settled, just due to the fact of how egregious of an act of what Wilcox did to him.
Robert Wilcox admitted in a signed statement that he put the rat emojis next to the inmates' names for staff's use only, not intending to cause unrest, and apologized. He received a 1-day suspension last year for violating a work rule. Wilcox left the DOC earlier this year.
Think about the burden the taxpayers are going to have to fork out for what one individual did intentionally. One person's already received $110,000. Now you have to times that by at least 4 more.
Wilkie, who was named in that lawsuit and still has death threats against him, has mixed emotions about the payout.
Here's a guy who wants to have me killed, but then he was done wrong so egregiously, he deserves some sort of compensation for that.
The Department of Justice tells Target 2 if that money is transferred from the trust fund to Benson while he's still in prison, it would be subject to deductions for restitution and court costs, but otherwise it would remain untouched. He's up for release in 2024. Now, as for Sergeant Wilcox, we told you back in May the Waushara County District Attorney decided not to file any charges for that incident, but Target 2 found out an investigator did refer a charge alleging criminal action in this case. What we found out, plus what the Department of Corrections is now changing because of this whole incident, all coming up tonight at 6. And of course, you can read more about the investigation in our past stories online.
Sure, thank you so much. Great work.
From WBAY TV, coverage you can count on. Action 2 News at 6 starts now.
To be honest with you, it was rage. Rage.
That's the first reaction from a former prison gang investigator after learning criminal charges were referred but never filed against a state employee who exposed the identities of confidential informants. Good evening. Thanks for joining us tonight. This involves a case Target 2 investigates, first uncovered back in January, what officials now refer to as the rat emoji incident.
A now former sergeant at the Redgranite Correctional Institution exposed the identities of inmates working as informants in a high-profile gang investigation by placing pictures of rats next to those names.
Other inmates quickly saw it, blowing their cover. As we first told you tonight at 5, Target 2 discovered the state agreed to settle a federal civil rights lawsuit with one of the inmates, paying the man incarcerated for armed robbery $110,000 of taxpayer money.
Now, Sarah Thomsen learned in this Target 2 Investigates follow-up, a criminal charge was recommended but not filed against the former prison worker at the center of the case.
We told you back in May the district attorney in Waushara County decided not to file criminal charges against now former Sergeant Robert Wilcox, who exposed the identities of 5 inmates at Redgranite Correctional last year. But this open records request Target 2 received late yesterday shows the DA's investigator thought there was criminal action and recommended a charge.
A kindergartner could figure out what happened in Waushara County.
To say Jason Wilkie is frustrated and angry probably doesn't go far enough. It was Wilkie's high-profile gang investigation involving a homicide and death threats to a former assistant DA that ended abruptly in January of 2018. The 5 inmates he'd turned into confidential informants were outed when Sergeant Robert Wilcox placed rat emojis next to their names on a paper and other inmates saw it.
Warden Meisner ruled it as horseplay. Since when does outing a confidential informant in a planned homicide case ever fall in the realm of horseplay? It doesn't.
As Target 2 uncovered in our original report, Wilcox was investigated internally by Redgranite Correctional staff and given a 1-day suspension. In a signed letter, he wrote there was no malice and apologized.
But intentionally putting people's lives in jeopardy is not horseplay, that's criminal.
Wilkie felt the incident rose to the level of criminal misconduct and turned to the Waushara County District Attorney, who assigned his investigator to take a look. These records obtained by Target 2 show that investigator recommended a criminal charge of violating laws governing state or county institutions, a misdemeanor. But the charge was never filed. The district attorney writing, quote, "I believe it is arguable that Wilcox violated this statute, calling the actions irresponsible and inappropriate. But it comes down to whether it was intentional." Wilkie argues it was.
Any reasonable person would know what he did was intentional.
The DA writes, "I am not sure that can be proven that Wilcox meant for inmates to see the rat emojis," adding it appears Wilcox's judgment was influenced by his frustration or grudge against Wilkie. The district attorney concluded the incident is better handled internally by the DOC.
We're supposed to be ethical and moral and carry ourselves on a different level when you're in law enforcement and corrections, and I'm going to stand by that.
The DOC tells Target 2 this has prompted a policy change in handling what it calls serious acts of misconduct, which did not always involve the Secretary's office, saying, quote, "The process has now changed so that Secretary-designee Carr will review all serious acts of misconduct regardless of the level of disciplinary action recommended."
Our calls to Robert Wilcox have not been returned.